Now, one really important part, and you're going to see some other graphs I believe here. This one is called the Tytler cycle, something I believe invented by a Scottish professor, Alexander Tytler, and it talks about this around 200-year cycle of how you see government starts to keep creating. So our job here is to understand this cycle and see that what would happen if we just keep falling to the hands of statism. If we keep falling to the hands of statism, we have this continuous cycle where although there may be a shift to, okay, let's change the government back to good again. Oh, it gets bad, now we gotta shift it to good again. Oh, it gets bad, we shift it to good again. There's no sustainable model. There's no long-term generational sustainable model that works through all the generations. And the problem here, the biggest reason why our mission in this movement is designed to work in its nature naturally is because if you look at the very top of this cycle, bondage to faith to courage, that particular area involves harm. Where you have this, it's actually, the harm is more dependence and apathy. Right there is the harm, and that's where the people start to oppose the conditions, as it says. So people start to oppose it around there, and then it sometimes can cause a little bit more harm from bondage to faith, but that's when people start moving things back in the right direction. Now that's the same direction we'll do when we initiate the movement, but there's going to be a different cycle thereafter: faith, courage, and liberty. Because abundance is where things can change. That is the focus on material things, abundance. And material things we know is already not of nature. So nature is intervening right at the abundant stage. And of liberty, we're redefining it not as something written on paper, but as something of natural law. And as long as natural law is present, man's law cannot be present. And statism, as long as that is opposed, there can never be a government that turns into selfishness, complacency, apathy, dependence, and bondage. So this is a really key cycle to understanding the nature of the cycle of government, which is really key to know as to how things would go if people do not follow the course of nature, they do not follow natural law, and they keep following government and thinking they could just keep making it better. There will always be ups and downs in life, but it'll have major downs, especially as we move on with technology and other things, as I mentioned, that will increase the harm done. And what we're trying to do is reduce the harm so that this cycle can be one rather only on the right side, only on the right side, and nowhere near the left side. We can just keep it going from abundance back to faith, right? Realizing, okay, these material things, we need to find faith, go back to ourselves, faith in nature, faith in God, whatever that may be for yourself, because that helps you seek the spiritual, which the material is directly opposed to. You study Satanism, you know that its elements is supposed to be crushing the consciousness, crushing the spiritual with the physical. So at that turn of abundance, we can bring it back to faith, and that can be a continuous 4-cycle rather than this complex 9-step cycle. So thank you for understanding that. I know this could be a little crazy in the fact that over 200 years, this happens to most of every government, and we're reaching 200 years now with the United States of America. So why even say that if it doesn't exist? That's the thing. We have to get this illusion out of people's minds, because this illusion is what's creating the cycle, and we're not learning from history clearly because it is a cycle. And I'll remind you, yes, there's cycles natural in nature, which is why that happens, because nature opposes those bondage. Nature opposes that dependence, right? The natural law is like, okay, you've suppressed me way too long, but they are getting away with it now, and that's what I'm scared with. As you see, this cycle is even being prolonged because the 200 years have already gone by. This is the first time a government has gone by over 200 years. You have to question why that is. It's because people are so dumbed down now and so left up to less power that they really feel like they can't do anything about it, and there is no escape from bondage, from what it's coming to be. So And they're carefully planning out their bondage too. It's not like they're going right to bondage. They're carefully planning it out, and that's the problem too, is little steps. They're taking it real slow. They know that past governments have not worked. They're taking it real slow, and they're making sure to assure that their efforts are completed in the way that can work out in the long run. So what we're looking at here is also a long-run agenda, but the diametrically opposed agenda, because we don't want government. We want the exact opposite. So funny how that works. If you study them, you can know exactly what to do as the opposite. It's just like saying, okay, well, if you're going to see this herd of sheep going toward one place, you want to be the exact opposite and probably not follow the herd of sheep. Okay, so this is the irony that we live in. Here you have a quote about the Tytler cycle, and it talks about who Alexander Tytler was. He was a Scottish advocate and judge, and he formulated the idea over 200 years ago. He was born around 1747 and died around 1813. Okay, he said, quote, "A democracy is always temporary in nature. It simply cannot exist as a permanent form of government." And as we know, republics are also democracies from the previous quote. I mean, this is like saying Republicans and Democrats are one and the same, which they are. Okay, then it says, quote, "A democracy will continue to exist up until the time that the voters discover that they can vote themselves generous gifts from the public treasury." Right? I mean, does your vote even matter? They say the vote is your voice. No, your voice is your voice. See how they denature certain things? It's like changing the definition of a rainbow, for example. I'm just putting that out there. Right? People will see things differently based on what they put in your face on the media and in the movies. Okay, this is how powerful our human bodies are to believe and also to manifest things in our lives. So realize this power not just done onto you, but the power that you have, that you allowed it to go into its motion. Then you realize that you are truly powerful, for the record. Then it says, quote, "From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidates who promise the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that every democracy will finally collapse due to loose fiscal policy, which is always followed by a dictatorship." And as we see, we have some really bad economics, and we see a collapse happening in civilization where many people believe it could be divide and conquer for even more control, especially since many people will be begging down to the government. So we really need to think different, and this is one of our best times to do this, even though this is something we could do anytime in case you're listening to this. So you have to take the action anytime you can, as soon as you can. So the average age, it says, quote, "The average age of the world's greatest civilizations from the beginning of history has been around 200 years. During those 200 years, these nations always progressed through the following sequence: from bondage to spiritual faith, from spiritual faith to great courage, from courage to liberty, from liberty to abundance, from abundance to selfishness, from selfishness to complacency, from complacency to apathy, from apathy to dependence, and from dependence back into bondage." So what could you learn from this Tytler cycle, being that we followed all this? Like I said, I think it's the nature of a government, essentially, in its cycle, looking at the greater scheme of things. And this is important to know, being if we want to create change in the future as a sort of movement ourselves, we're going to have cycles of our own in nature, but we want to make sure that that cycle doesn't turn into one of bringing up government again, because that's the main goal. And as long as that is kept out of the equation, we should be good as a human species, because government has been the very main suppressors of the human will and of the human consciousness. Now, technology about that, like I said, if you have governments mostly in control of technology, and they may press it when people are opposed to their agendas. However, people, again, are also in control of the technology. We're in control of everything. So they may have control over some technology, but as governments decline, I assure you that technology will likely decline with it. And in fact, you'll probably have more freedom on the web and so forth like that. There's going to be a lot more alternatives to Windows. And like I said, there's going to be a lot more potential, a lot more innovation occurring, and where you want to say, okay, well, that's more abundance. I think right now we live in a state of abundance, but we have this great material push, whereas I think in the world I'm talking about, we have abundance, but we can also have much spiritual worth, because people will be promoting that more often, being that they see the importance of nature, being that their voices aren't censored, and that if it's actually working for them, then it's definitely something that is going to help them. And it's keeping each other accountable is a spiritual practice, through using our consciousness, and then recognizing natural law is a spiritual law. The very idea of abundance turning into something more than what it is not going to turn into anything worse, especially since government isn't existent. So it wouldn't turn into dependence and dictatorship, because who's the dictator if nobody's in charge? You see what I mean? This is what along the lines I'm going with. Now, if we were to do more research then on Alexander Tytler and his views on government, we'd see this, quote, all government is essentially of the nature of a monarchy. Okay, it's just, to me, it's just so funny to me how I see this word nature thrown around, and I'm telling you, it's something that can really help us understand the world around us. And so you see it time and time again, and you see it among every leader that you've heard of under the sun that has been assassinated, or every leader who spoke out against the system, essentially. So, quote, the people flatter them have the sovereign power. These are, in fact, words without meaning. It is true that they elected governors, but how are these elections brought about? In every instance of election by the mass of a people, through the influence of those governors themselves, and by means the most opposite to a free and disinterested choice, by the basest corruption and bribery. But those governors once elected, where is the boastest freedom of the people? They must submit to their rule and control with the same abandonment of their natural liberty, the freedom of their will, and the command of their actions, as if they were under the rule of a monarch. So he's saying at the very nature of any government, it's still the same thing as a monarch. It's just a different leader. It doesn't really matter. The same belief systems are being done here. And that's what he's going on, right, is belief system. This whole idea of selfishness to abundance, these are belief systems, which is why I believe this cycle is actually really, really crucial to understanding government. It's not just talking about what's happening, it's talking about the belief systems, it's talking about the why things are happening. So that quote was very powerful within itself. I encourage you to read it over yourself, in fact, if you want to look into this. And so then it says, quote, nothing better than a utopian theory, a splendid chimera, descriptive of a state of society that never did and never could exist, a republic not of men, but of angels. What he's saying is that men is trying to be God, and that governments are just trying to seek as a utopian theory, So, he's specifically talking about some of the more optimistic visions of democracy as written by other people who say that, okay, government could exist perfectly within this society or perfectly within that society. He's saying a republic not of men but of angels, it would have to be essentially of gods, for a utopian world. Well, guess what? Actually, funny irony enough, natural law is God's law. So if you are living under natural law, you're living among the angels. You're living among the gods. You are under God's rule, not some man who is fallen to Satanism, most likely. Then we have, quote, while man is being instigated by the love of power, a passion visible in an infant and common to us even with the inferior animals, he will seek personal superiority and preference to every matter of a general concern. This is just so powerful to me, because this is now then talking about the nature of man and how man is seeking the love of power, and it's like a child and they're inferior, as we see Mark Twain is saying that we're the lowest animals. This is just so key. Okay, he will seek personal superiority and preference to every matter of a general concern, saying that they just want control everywhere, which is why they love war and they love material things, and it's just something that they constantly do within a daily life. Like, this is their practice, essentially. Instead, people could be practicing things of natural law, as I'm encouraging to do here, practicing love, practicing self-reflection, practicing, healing your body. That's all a practice. Instead, people are putting their practice toward superiority, toward these unnatural things. So guess what's going to manifest? Exactly that. Okay, that's how powerful human beings can be, but we are not gods at all. Okay, but you can definitely see the resemblance and the connection that we do have, being that is. Okay, then he says, quote, or at best he will employ himself in advancing the public good as the means of individual distinction and elevation. He will promote the interest of the state from the selfish but most useful passion of making himself considerable in that establishment which he labors to aggrandize. Such is the true picture of man as a political agent. So going again based on the nature that man is, becoming this political animal, political agent, and always going toward his own demise in a way. So then you have here from the Wikipedia, it says, Tytler believed that democratic forms of government, such as those of Greece and Rome, have a natural evolution from initial virtue toward eventual corruption and decline. In Greece, for example, Tytler argues that, quote, the patriotic spirit and love of ingenious freedom became gradually corrupted as the nation advanced in power and splendor. Right? They just have everything and everything is going great, which is why it started to go away. And you started to see that also with that quote, that very ironic quote that to live in a state of peace, it just created more war. Like, this is the irony that government has been creating. It's this play on the irony that is naturally existent, and it's making it more dangerous. Okay? Quote, patriotism. Okay, so listen to this, patriots. Patriotism always exists in the greatest degree in rude nations and in an early period of society. Like all other affections and passions, it operates with the greatest force where it meets with the greatest difficulties. But in a state of ease and safety, as if wanting its appropriate nourishment, it languishes and decays. It is a law of nature to which no experience has ever furnished an exception, that the rising grandeur and opulence of a nation must be balanced by the decline of its heroic virtues. So this is so amazing to me, because he's saying that this decline in nations, and he's rooting it back down to mentality. He's rooting it back down to the roots as to why is it that these nations are rising? Why is it that they're falling? And he says the law of nature. I mean, is this any more descriptive than what it has to be for what we're talking about? This is just incredible to me. And you could even do research among others who studied the cycles of governments, and one such people is also Toynbee, somebody who I'm also not too familiar with, but I came across one of his works where he studies the cycles of governments, and this is what he has to say. Here you have a quote on the Wikipedia. It says, he argues that for civilizations to be born, the challenge must be the golden mean, that excessive challenge will crush the civilization and too little challenge will cause it to stagnate. Now this is also very reflective as to what we should be doing and what the mentalities are happening as well. Notice there's this also emphasis on mentality. Okay, so now we continue. Civilizations continue to grow only when they meet one challenge only to be met by another in a continuous cycle of challenge and response. Kind of like you want to maybe say problem, reaction, solution, right? But instead of us choosing the response, perhaps it's the elite saying, okay, this is what must happen in order for this to must happen. And that's how they've gotten a lot of control, is through setting up events and making sure events happen in the way that they want to, or they always have a backup plan so it works up in the way that they shall desire. He argues that civilizations develop in different ways due to their different environments and different approaches to the challenges they face. He argues that growth is driven by quote-unquote creative minorities, those who find solutions to the challenges, who inspire rather than compel others to follow their innovative lead. So, as you know, we've been talking about creativity is what allows people to move on and innovate. This is something that's going to be very crucial to moving on any movement such as our own. Okay, so he says creative minorities find solutions to the challenges a civilization faces, while the great mass follow these solutions by imitation, solutions they otherwise would be incapable of discovering on their own. Okay, so there's going to be people who find creative things. There's going to be other people who find creative things, and the idea here is to bring those ideas together and allow the masses, the many people, to also express their creative self and understand this creativity and its purpose among this cycle of life, okay, and the reasoning behind its movements, in this case of civilization, which is a movement within itself, which is why we are the one counter agenda, okay, a movement against such movement, because they want to move us in their direction. We want to move in the direction of nature, in the direction of righteous, moral, objective truth. Okay, in 1939 it says, Toynbee wrote, quote, "The challenge of being called upon to create a political world order, the framework for an economic world order, now confronts our modern Western society." Now, this is really telling to a lot of people in the truth community. Using even the specific words world order, we know that we have been living in this new world order, and what they've wanted to be formed for quite a while into forming a world government, so to speak. You may call it a conspiracy all you want, but they write about it in their own writings as well. The bloodlines, those at the very top of the political structures. And that's why it says political world order, and then it says economic world order, because those we know who control the money supply control the rest of society. This is even said by the bankers themselves again. And it says our modern Western society, as we know the Western society is often the most manipulated, often the most under attack, and often the ones who receive it the most from perhaps even other nations. Now, on the topic of breakdown and disintegration, Toynbee does not see the breakdown of civilizations as caused by loss of control over the physical environment, by loss of control over the human environment, or by attacks from the outside. He sees it rather that it comes from the deterioration of the creative minority, which eventually ceases to be creative and degenerates into merely a dominant minority. Okay, so this is really key, because if we are not using our consciousness, not using our willpower to create new things, who are the ones that are innovating? Those at the top, the dominant minority, those who just simply want to control others, given the current environment, given any environment, they seek control. So if you do not have a creative minority, this creative group of individuals who can help bring this new side every once in a while to change things up, you do have this degeneration into a dominant minority. This is what he's saying as his theory for this cycle of governance. And he argues that creative minorities deteriorate due to a worship of their quote-unquote former self, by which they become prideful and fail adequately to address the next challenge they face. So they are not innovating, essentially. They are not being an innovative society. They're not moving toward as much as they should. And of course, this is specifically talking about a civilization, a government, okay, which does not have creative minorities. It does not have these creative aspects that are essential to the human cause. And when you realize that these creative aspects are rooted within nature, and that nature is what provides a lot of this creativity, and seeking our true selves and our true destiny, because we each have our own creative place, when you realize that's coming from nature, not from the government, then you start to connect the dots even more. So it says, results of the breakdown. The final breakdown results in, quote, positive acts of creation. The dominant minority seeks to create a universal state to preserve its power and influence, and the internal proletariat seeks to create a universal church to preserve its spiritual values and cultural norms. So a universal state, a universal church, perhaps a universal monetary supply, I would assume then too, right? And everything else universal coming from that government, because they need a system to maintain this quote-unquote universal state. And as we see, as he even described by world order, we start to connect the dots there, and it starts to make sense. A new world order is supposed to represent this world governance, to which a universal state, as he describes here, does then make sense. And being that that is breaching the Western world, it's just a matter of when people will wake up if we want to get rid of that system from manifesting in its works as it is right now. So, and we have to be careful, right? Because we see this accountability, we see this decline of creativity. We see that right now in our society where that's giving way to a dominant minority. Okay, and we have to understand that when we have creativity, when we have human consciousness, when we have natural law, and then when we have man's law, a lot of these things are going to conflict with one another. And we have to understand how is it that they conflict. And this, one of these researchers, like him and Tytler, they're just more examples of how we can understand our world a little bit better through the lens of cycles and progression. And he goes about this idea that without creativity you have these norms in place, these societal norms, these standards, these boundaries, if you will, from creativity, shall you see it like that. And he even made a prediction here. It says, it remains to be seen what will come of the 4 remaining civilizations of the 21st century. You have Western civilization, Islamic society, Hindu society, and the Far East, from his predictions, right? So he says, Toynbee argues 2 possibilities. They might all merge with the Western civilization, or Western civilization might develop a universal state after its quote-unquote time of troubles decay and die. So we see projections if we were to continue in this lens of government. But we also see what creates government, what helps disintegrate it, and that is the key, shall we want to move forward in the right direction.